So IEMs are getting really expensive, and the Mysticraft TET is a really good example of that. This is a $7,700 in-ear monitor that sits just below the brand's flagship IEM, the Hex, which costs, I believe, $9,000. So I do want to give a shout out to one of my viewers for very generously sending this in for review. This IEM is very difficult to get hands on. I don't even see like a product page online of it. And I believe it's limited to like 33 of these units being released worldwide. So yeah, we have one of them here, and today we're going to be taking a look at it. Starting with the unboxing experience of this IEM, honestly I find it to be pretty disappointing. It's highly reminiscent of the unboxing experience that comes with the Myth, the brand's $1,000 in-ear monitor. And I don't know, something about that just strikes me a little off when this is an IEM that literally cost over 7 times as much. And it's just a night and day difference compared to something like the Subtonic Storm, which actually costs less than this IEM, the TET. And it comes with a hard carry suitcase, as well as, a custom leather pouch. So moving on to the sound, at a high level, the TET kind of captures the new sound, the new tuning ethos that Mysticraft has been trying to put forward, and that we've seen with both the Hex and the Myth. So basically what this means is a more unconventional type of tuning, less emphasis on the upper treble like with Lee's previous work in the Elysian IEMs, and generally speaking, a very technical sound when it comes to a sense of dynamics, detail retrieval, and all that fun stuff. However, compared to both the Hex and the Myth, I would say that the TET is generally more tonally correct, especially in the way it approaches its mid-range. But first, let's start with the bass response of this IEM. The TET's bass shelf is almost like identical, I think, to both the Myth as well as the Hex. So it's definitely a sub-bass focused shelf where it has a lot of quantity, especially around like 50 to 100 hertz. That's just going to give it a little bit more depth and a little bit more authority relative to a lot of other IEMs that have this, sub-bass shelf that's cut off under 200 hertz. So compared to the Myth, just because that's the last Mysticraft IEM that I had on hand, the Myth and the TET, they definitely sound quite similar in the bass. The biggest distinction between them is probably the Myth's bass. It sounds more bouncy and just more flowy in general, whereas the bass on the TET, it's a little bit tighter, it's a little bit more authoritative, and it's more textured in general. Overall, I would say that the bass response on the TET, it's pretty close to being top tier bass. However, it's just a little bit more dry sounding than I personally prefer. So now moving upwards to the mid-range, like I said, this is where the TET starts to depart from the tuning formula of both the Myth and the Hex. So the Myth and the Hex, they have quite unconventional pin and notches. They notch at around 1.7K hertz, and this definitely brings forward a greater sense of detail. Like, it exaggerates characteristics in a singer's voice that you would hear normally. However, it's also a little bit uncanny at times, and that's kind of what the TET fixes by comparison. With that being said, I definitely would not consider the TET's mid-range to be neutral at all. It has a bump of energy at around 3 to 4K hertz, which just brings forward female vocals quite a bit and contributes to an overall slightly leaner mid-range. So there are two products of this bump at 3 to 4K hertz. One is that despite this IEM not having that, 1.7K hertz pin and notch, it's still going to sound quite detailed because that 3 to 4K hertz bump, it's bringing back that detail and that presence in the mid-range. However, the other consequence of this is that I find that the TET's mid-range is just a little bit intense at times, and it doesn't work as well for, louder listening or if you're listening to a lot of female vocals. So that about summarizes the mid-range of the TET. I think it's pretty decent overall. However, if you're looking for longer term listening, louder listening, then it might not be the best mid-range for you, despite it being extremely detailed. Now moving to the treble of the TET, honestly the treble on the TET is not really my favorite. It's, again, highly reminiscent of both the Hex and the Myth, where you have a series of micro peaks all throughout the treble, as well as deltas, little deltas in between them, that lend to a lot of texture and perceived detail retrieval on treble notes. With that being said, compared to even the Myth, I would say that the TET is even more scooped out in the lower treble. And the result of this is that you lose a lot of like crack on snares and stuff like that. You lose a lot of that initial energy when treble instrumentation hits. The other thing I'll say is that I feel like the extension on the TET is not like the best past 15K hertz. Don't get me wrong, like it's still pretty decent, but there's definitely like a very pronounced decline after 15K hertz on the TET's treble response. And the result of this is that you're losing just a little bit of extra shimmer up there that I personally think is true to life, what I hear in real life, at least with real treble instruments. Overall, the treble of the TET, it sounds fine overall, and I could definitely see a lot of listeners liking this type of treble response actually. If they want something that's more non-fatiguing and still extremely detailed, it's just that it doesn't quite align with my preferences. And I'm someone who enjoys more linear extension, especially past like 10K hertz. And generally speaking, I do think that like I could go either way on, the lower treble. I do like that region sometimes being scooped out a little bit. I think that the TET just takes it a little bit far in that regard. Okay, so when it comes to technicalities, the TET is obviously extremely impressive. I would say it's easily world class for its sense of detail retrieval, despite it, being a little bit dipped in those lower and upper treble regions. It just sounds extremely detailed to me. The imaging on the TET is also superb, super pinpoint, very wide open soundstage. The difference between the hex and the myth is that those IEMs are going to sound a little bit, I feel like those IEMs sound a little bit more unique for the imaging. At the same time, they don't sound quite correct. And the reason for that is the nature of their pinna compensation and the way they peak at that 1.7, 1.8K hertz region. The dynamics on the TET are also superb, although I would say they're not quite to the level of either the hex or the storm in that regard. And the reason for this mostly just comes down to the respective treble responses of these IEMs. Compared to the hex, for example, the hex is going to be more linear in its upper treble extension past 15K hertz, and it also has a little bit more lower treble, I believe. And generally speaking, the storm, I think it has superior treble to both of these IEMs, where it has more filled in, or just a more linear response in general that lends that extra sense of, slamminess and explosiveness overall in the sound. So the big question to me really is whether the TET is worth $7,700. And for this, I think it does help to bring in some comparisons just so we can kind of gauge the overall, value proposition of the TET. So starting with the Elysium Annihilator, the 2023 model, which I do own and have on hand, comparatively, I would say that the TET, it does sound like it has an edge in technical performance overall. It sounds a little bit more detailed. It sounds like it images better for sure. And yeah, the bass for sure, like when we're talking about like dynamics, the bass on it, I would say on the TET is better than on the Annihilator 2023. All that being said, the treble response of the Annihilator, it's definitely superior to the TET to me. It just has less scoop in that 5 to 6K hertz region, and it has significantly more upper treble extension versus the TET. And overall, because of that energy it has in the treble versus the TET, it lends the timbre of the Annihilator to just a more animated, energetic quality that the TET is more subtle about by comparison. So just generally speaking, I see the Annihilator as more of a one-trick pony, a set that you own if you have multiple sets and you want a different flavor of sound, whereas the TET sort of falls more in the all-rounder category for me. So within the context of all-rounders, let's compare it to the Subtonic Storm. Compared to the Subtonic Storm, I would say that the Storm is simply the better package overall. And I don't say that just from the perspective of its accessories, its build and whatnot. It applies to the sound in general. The sound of the Storm, it's truly neutral. It's very close to being truly neutral. And just overall, it's a lot more well-rounded and geared towards longer term listening than the TET is. Overall, I do find that the, Storm, it sounds just as technical as the TET, if not more detailed and more dynamic. And obviously this could be a bit source dependent, but I just feel like, off the top of my head, I feel like the bar, the ceiling for the Storm is higher than it is with the TET. And I think the kicker here really is that the Storm is actually cheaper than the TET, so I don't really find the value proposition of the TET to be all that great compared to the Storm. So moving the bar a bit lower to around like $2,000 with the The Audio Valhalla, which I also own for comparison, I would say that the TET, it definitely has an edge in terms of technical performance versus the Valhalla. It sounds more detailed for sure. It sounds like maybe it images a bit wider and more spaciously. With that being said, I think that the tonal balance of the Valhalla is debatably, another good option versus the TET. It's a lot warmer by comparison, and it has more upper treble energy versus the TET. And because of that, I could definitely see some listeners preferring the Valhalla actually for longer term listening versus the TET, despite the TET being unequivocally more technical, at least to my ears, versus the Valhalla. And obviously you're also going to be getting those titanium shells and the option for a custom faceplate with the Valhalla, which doesn't seem like it's an option with the TET. So the bottom line here is that the TET is undoubtedly an excellent IEM. In terms of raw technical performance, it's easily up there with some of the best of the best. With that being said, we're talking about a $7,700 IEM, And because of that, the expectations are extremely high for this IEM. And at least for me, the TET does not meet or it does not exceed that bar, especially when you take into account its competition. If anything, the TET really illustrates the law of diminishing returns in the high-end audio market. It's a great sounding IEM, but it's not groundbreaking to my ears, if I'm being honest. But yeah, I would be curious to know, if you guys had $7,700 to spend on an IEM, would you buy one IEM like the TET, or would you kind of diversify it around a wider collection? I know for me the answer is obvious. I tend to diversify, and that's just because I am a filthy whore when it comes to IEMs as well. But yeah, I would be curious to hear what you guys would do. Let me know in the comments, and I'll catch you guys in my next video.